At 11:40 p.m., 14 Ukrainian carrier drones lifted off from the Mykolaiv region and turned south toward occupied Crimea, flying straight into one of the more densely defended stretches of coastline Russia controls. By the time the mission was finished, Russian air defense had caught, jammed, or shot down every single one of those 14 carriers, and it still worked. That sentence should sound impossible. It isn't, and understanding why it isn't tells you almost everything about how this war is actually being fought now, far more than any single explosion does. The target that night was a Russian naval drone base near Snizhne in occupied Crimea, a facility built to store, arm, and launch the unmanned surface boats Russia has increasingly relied on to hunt Ukrainian shipping and defend its own coastline. Russia has invested heavily in this specific category of weapon over the past year, betting that unmanned boats could do cheaply and at scale what its conventional navy, already battered and largely confined to port after years of losses in the Black Sea, could no longer manage safely. Destroy the boats sitting in that base, and Russia loses a weapon system it has spent real money and real effort trying to scale up. Destroy the base itself, and Russia loses the infrastructure that makes building more of them worthwhile in the first place. Standing between those 14 carriers and the base was one of the more heavily layered defensive setups along this stretch of coastline. A Tor M2 sat somewhere along the approach, a short-range system built specifically to catch exactly this kind of low, fast, expendable threat before it gets anywhere near a target worth protecting. A Ka-52 attack helicopter patrolled the corridor, capable of visually acquiring and engaging targets that ground radar alone might miss. Its crew trained specifically to hunt exactly the kind of small, low-flying drone formation that had become common enough along this coastline to warrant dedicated patrols. A Krasuka-4 electronic warfare system worked the same airspace from a fixed position, flooding the approach with jamming meant to sever control links and corrupt navigation data before any drone got close enough to matter. One of the more capable jamming platforms Russia fields, specifically because it can degrade a wide band of frequencies simultaneously rather than targeting one narrow signal type. And behind all of it, S-400 and Pantsir coverage extended the kill zone out further still. The S-400 handling anything flying high or fast enough to register at long range, Pantsir closing the short-range gap with both missiles and rapid cannon fire. Layered defense stacked on layered defense, built around the same assumption every version of this network is built around, that a defender who can see a threat early enough and often enough can always find a way to stop it. Russia's defenses did exactly what that assumption promised. Over the course of the approach, GPS jamming degraded the formation's navigation, sending some drones drifting off their intended lines. The Tor M2 caught contacts it could track cleanly and brought several down. The Ka-52 added its own kills to the total. By the time the 14 carrier drones had finished their run, every single one of them had been detected, engaged, or driven off course by the defenses arrayed against them. None of that stopped the mission, because the carriers were never the actual weapon. They were the delivery system for something smaller, cheaper, and considerably harder to stop once it was already close. 6 of the 14 carriers survived long enough to reach release range. At roughly 11:58, close enough to the target that whatever happened to the carrier itself no longer mattered for the outcome, each surviving carrier released 2 FPV drones, 12 total, smaller, faster, and built around a different guidance philosophy entirely from the aircraft that had just carried them most of the way there. Each FPV carried an RPG-derived warhead, some configured armor-piercing for punching through hulls and hardened equipment, others thermobaric, built to produce a sustained blast and heat effect specifically effective against fuel, ammunition, and enclosed spaces, rather than simple structural penetration. The choice to split warhead types this way was not incidental. A base like this one holds multiple categories of target that respond very differently to the same explosive. A hull needs penetration to disable. A focused charge capable of punching through the relatively thin metal or composite skin of a small surface vessel and damaging whatever critical equipment sits behind it. A fuel store needs something else entirely. Sustained heat and overpressure to actually ignite and keep burning rather than simply crack and leak, which is exactly the profile a thermobaric warhead is built to deliver. a fuel-air mixture that detonates over a larger volume and burns longer than a conventional shaped charge ever could. Sending 12 identical warheads at a target this varied would have meant some of them landing on exactly the wrong kind of target for what they were built to do. An armor-piercing charge wasted against an open fuel tank, or a thermobaric warhead failing to properly breach a hardened hull. Splitting the payload in advance meant that whichever 12 targets these drones eventually found, a meaningful share of them were going to be hit with exactly the right kind of explosive for the job. Here is the detail that actually explains why Russia's electronic warfare, which had already proven effective enough to bring down carrier after carrier on the approach, suddenly stopped working at all in the final stretch. The FPVs were not flying on GPS. They were not depending on satellite navigation of any kind. The exact signal every jamming system on that coastline had been built to corrupt or deny. They were flying on a short-range radio relay controlled directly by human operators watching a live video feed and steering the drone by hand through the final approach. The same basic control method that has made first-person view drones so difficult to fully suppress throughout this entire war. A Krasuka 4 is an extraordinarily capable system against GPS-dependent threats and against longer-range communication links. It has almost nothing to grab onto against a short-range analog or digital video relay operating at close distance between a drone and an operator who might be sitting barely a few kilometers away, watching through the drone's own camera and correcting its path in real time based on what he actually sees rather than what any satellite tells the aircraft it should believe. Jam that link, and you are not fighting a navigation system. You are fighting a person, watching, reacting, and adjusting faster than most automated countermeasures are built to account for. This is, in a sense, the same fundamental asymmetry that has made FPV drones one of the most difficult categories of threat to fully suppress throughout this entire war, on both sides of the front. A jamming system built around denying satellite signals or disrupting a specific known control protocol is solving a well-defined technical problem. A human operator adapting in real time to whatever the jamming actually manages to do, switching frequencies, adjusting the flight path, simply flying through degraded video quality rather than losing the drone entirely, is a moving target in the truest sense, one that does not sit still long enough for any fixed countermeasure to fully solve. Electronic warfare can make that operator's job harder. It struggles to make it impossible because the thing actually flying the final stretch is not code responding to a fixed set of inputs. It is a person, and people adapt to specific problems the moment they see them appear. That is the entire reason this mission survived contact with one of Russia's more sophisticated defended stretches of coastline. Every layer of Russian air defense that night was optimized to stop exactly the threat it was built around. Fixed-wing carrier drones flying predictable courses on GPS-dependent navigation, vulnerable to jamming, trackable by radar, killable by a Tor-M2 or a Ka-52 given enough warning. The mission planners on the Ukrainian side built the operation specifically around accepting that every one of those carriers might die, because the actual weapon was never going to be caught by any of those systems in the first place. The 12 FPVs that made it past the carrier phase reached the base largely undetected just after midnight, arriving low, fast, and controlled by hands rather than software in the final seconds that actually mattered. What they found inside was exactly the mix of targets this entire operation had been built around reaching. Unmanned surface boats, several of them still unfinished, mid-assembly, representing weeks or months of work that would now never see open water. Fuel storage sitting close enough to the boats to matter for both. Satellite communications equipment, the kind of infrastructure a naval drone base depends on to coordinate with vessels operating beyond visual range, struck specifically because damaging that equipment degrades the entire base's operational reach, even for boats that survive the physical attack untouched. And trailers, the unglamorous but genuinely essential equipment used to move, store, and prepare these vessels for deployment, destroyed alongside everything else in a strike that clearly aimed at the base's overall capacity to function rather than any single high-value target sitting inside it. That last point matters more than it might first appear. A base like this one does not function as a single valuable object waiting to be destroyed. It functions as a small ecosystem of interdependent equipment. Boats that need fuel, fuel that needs storage, storage that needs to be reachable by the trailers moving material in and out, communications equipment tying deployed vessels back to shore-based control. Damage any one piece badly enough, and the rest of the ecosystem degrades even if it technically survives intact, because a boat with no fuel and no way to coordinate with command is not meaningfully different from a boat that was destroyed outright, at least for as long as the surrounding infrastructure stays broken. The armor-piercing warheads did their job against hulls and equipment casings. The thermobaric warheads found fuel and enclosed storage, producing exactly the sustained, spreading damage that category of warhead exists to deliver. Fires that do not simply flare and die, but keep burning through whatever flammable material happens to be nearby. Between the two warhead types working against the specific targets each had been assigned to, the base absorbed damage across nearly every category of asset it actually depended on to function. Not one dramatic explosion, but a spread of smaller, individually devastating hits landing across boats, fuel, communications, and support equipment almost simultaneously. By the time the strike was finished, a meaningful share of the base's unmanned surface vessel inventory, several of them still under construction and therefore representing pure lost labor and materials rather than combat losses in any conventional sense, had been destroyed or severely damaged, alongside the fuel, communications, and logistics infrastructure that had made the base function as a coherent operating location rather than just a collection of separate assets sitting near each other. None of what made this mission work required Ukraine to build some entirely new category of weapon. Carrier drones releasing smaller strike drones is not a new idea in this war. FPV drones with RPG-derived warheads are not new either. What made this specific operation effective was the layering, accepting that the outer shell of the attack, the carriers, would likely be detected and destroyed, and building the actual payload specifically to survive exactly the countermeasures that outer shell had already absorbed on its behalf. That is where the real cost asymmetry in this story lives, and it is worth being explicit about the numbers rather than leaving them implied. Russia expended a Tor M2's interceptor missiles, a Ka-52's flight hours and munitions, and sustained operation of a Krasuka-4 electronic warfare system, all genuinely expensive, sophisticated assets to stop carrier drones that, individually, likely cost a small fraction of a single interceptor missile fired against them. And after spending all of that, defending correctly, by the standards each individual system is actually built to meet, Russia still lost the base anyway, because the entire engagement it had just won was, from the attacker's perspective, an acceptable and expected loss rather than a genuine setback. Put the numbers side by side and the imbalance becomes almost absurd. A single R-77 or comparable interceptor fired by a modern air defense system routinely costs several $100,000, sometimes considerably more depending on the specific munition involved. A fixed-wing carrier drone built primarily to deliver two small FPVs to a release point costs a tiny fraction of that figure, and the FPVs themselves, built around commercially available components and RPG-derived warheads, cost less still. Russia's defenders were not losing an unfair fight because they made mistakes. They were losing an unfair fight because the entire exchange rate built into this kind of engagement favors whoever is willing to lose the cheaper asset, and on this particular night, Ukraine had built its entire mission around exactly that willingness. This is not a story about Russian air defense failing. Every system involved did close to exactly what it was designed to do and did it well. It is a story about what happens when a defender optimizes entirely around stopping the visible, trackable, jammable layer of an attack, and the side attacking has already built its actual objective to survive specifically what that defender is good at. A Tor M2 that shoots down every incoming carrier drone in a raid like this one has still, in the way that actually matters, lost the engagement, because the carriers were never the point. Every naval drone base Russia has built or is building around occupied Crimea now sits behind the same uncomfortable question this strike just answered. It does not matter how many layers of radar, jamming, and interceptor coverage protect the approach if the actual payload arriving at the end of that approach was never depending on anything those layers were built to stop. Russia can add more Tor M2 batteries, fly more helicopter patrols, deploy more electronic warfare systems along this coastline, and every one of those additions will genuinely make the carrier phase of an attack like this one harder to survive. None of it changes the fundamental fact that the actual weapon, 12 human-guided FPVs in the final stretch, was never the thing any of that additional coverage was built to stop in the first place. That gap is not a temporary oversight waiting to be patched with one more radar upgrade. It reflects a deeper mismatch between how modern layered air defense is designed, around detecting and intercepting automated signal-dependent threats at range, and the actual shape of the threat now arriving in its final seconds. A person with a controller and a video feed, making decisions no jamming system can fully predict. Closing that gap would require Russia to solve a problem considerably harder than adding another battery to the coastline. Finding a way to reliably detect and stop a human being reacting in real time, at close range, faster than that human can adapt to whatever countermeasure gets thrown at them. What do you think? Is layered air defense fundamentally losing this arms race against cheap, human-guided drones, or can Russia adapt its defenses fast enough to close this specific gap? Let us know in the comments below.